Emma didn't know that the man watching her from across the crowded banquet hall was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. She didn't know that he had been searching for his fated mate for over a decade. And she certainly didn't know that the moment she stumbled while carrying the wine pitcher, spilling burgundy across the marble floor in a cascade of crimson drops, her entire world was about to change forever. All she knew was that she had ruined everything. Again. The autumn banquet was the most important event of the season, where nobles from across the kingdom gathered to celebrate the harvest and discuss trade agreements that would sustain them through winter. Emma had been working in the kitchen since dawn, invisible in her borrowed servant's dress that hung loose on her too thin frame, trying desperately to blend into the background as she always did, trying to survive another day without drawing attention to herself. But then her sister arrived. Vivian swept into the great hall on the arm of her merchant husband, dripping in sapphires and silk, her golden hair perfectly arranged in the latest court fashion. She was everything Emma was not. Beautiful, wealthy, wanted, the kind of woman who belonged in places like this, who had never known what it felt like to go to bed hungry or wonder if tomorrow would bring a roof over her head. Their eyes met across the room, and Emma's blood went cold. "Well, well," Vivian's voice carried across the marble floors as she approached the servants' station where Emma stood frozen. "Look what crawled out from the kitchens. I should have known they'd put you to work here. It's fitting, really." Emma's hands trembled as she gripped the wine pitcher tighter. She had hoped foolishly that Vivian might not notice her, that she could get through the evening without this, without the shame that always followed in her sister's wake like a toxic perfume. "Vivian, please," Emma whispered, glancing nervously at the other servants who had stopped their work to watch. "Not here." "Not here?" Vivian laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "Oh, sister dear, this is exactly where this conversation needs to happen, among people who understand what you really are." The wine pitcher slipped. Emma watched in horror as it tumbled from her shaking hands, the deep red wine splashing across the pristine white marble, staining everything it touched. The hall fell silent, hundreds of eyes turning toward the source of the commotion, toward her. Heat burned in her cheeks as she dropped to her knees, frantically trying to clean up the mess with her apron, her borrowed dress soaking up the wine until she looked like she was covered in blood. This was it. She would be dismissed, thrown out onto the streets again, left with nothing. "How pathetic!" Vivian's voice rose above the whispered murmurs of the crowd. "Look at her, scrambling around on the floor like a dog. This is my sister, everyone, the girl who thinks she deserves better than what she is." Emma's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Not here, not in front of all these people. "She's been like this since we were children," Vivian continued, addressing the crowd as if Emma wasn't even there. Always dreaming of things beyond her reach, always believing that someone, somewhere, might actually want her. But look at her now, 23 years old, and what does she have to show for it? Nothing. No husband. No prospects. No hope. The words landed like physical blows, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. Emma had heard them before, in different forms, but never like this. Never in front of so many people, never with such cruel delight. "She'll die alone," Vivian declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent hall. "No man could ever want something so pathetic, so broken, so utterly worthless." Laughter rippled through the crowd, soft and cruel, and Emma felt something inside her chest crack clean through. She needed to run, needed to get away from here, from them, from the sound of her own heart breaking in front of everyone who mattered in the kingdom. She started to rise, to flee, when a shadow fell across her. "That's enough." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. Every sound in the hall died instantly, as if the very air had forgotten how to carry noise. Emma looked up from her position on the floor to see a pair of perfectly polished black boots, then higher, to dark trousers, and a midnight blue coat that spoke of wealth and power beyond anything she had ever imagined. When her eyes finally reached his face, her breath caught. He was devastatingly handsome in the way that dangerous things often were, with dark hair that looked like it had been touched by moonlight and eyes the colour of winter storms. There was something predatory about the way he stood, something that made every instinct Emma had ever developed scream that this man was not safe. Not for her heart, not for her sanity, not for the careful walls she had built around herself to survive. But when he looked at her, really looked at her, she felt something impossible happen in her chest. Something warm and golden and alive, like sunshine breaking through clouds after the longest winter. "I said that's enough," he repeated, his gaze never leaving Emma's face as he extended his hand toward her. Around them, the crowd had gone deathly quiet, as if they were witnessing something they didn't quite understand, but instinctively knew was important. "Sir, you don't understand," Vivian stammered, her voice smaller now, uncertain. "She's just a servant. She's nothing." "She's everything." The words hit Emma like lightning, sending heat racing up her spine and settling somewhere behind her sternum like a second heartbeat. She stared at his outstretched hand, afraid to take it, afraid not to, afraid of what it might mean, what it might cost her, what it might change. "Come with me," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made her think of safety, of shelter, of all the things she had stopped believing in years ago. Around them, the crowd watched in stunned silence as Emma placed her wine-stained hand in his. The moment their skin touched, electricity shot up her arm, spreading through her entire body like wildfire. She had never felt anything like it, this connection that seemed to bypass her brain entirely and speak directly to some deep, primal part of her soul. He pulled her gently to her feet, his touch careful, reverent, as if she were something precious rather than the broken thing she knew herself to be. When she swayed slightly, overwhelmed by sensation and shock, his other hand came up to steady her elbow, and she felt that golden warmth pulse stronger between them. "You're safe now," he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. "I promise." Emma didn't know why she believed him. She had learned long ago not to trust promises from strangers, especially powerful ones. But something about the way he looked at her, the way he had defended her without even knowing her name, made her want to try, made her want to be brave just this once. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and let him lead her away from the wreckage of spilled wine and shattered dignity, away from her sister's shocked face and the crowd's curious whispers. As they walked toward the great doors of the banquet hall, she felt the golden thread in her chest pull taut, connecting her to this stranger who had appeared like salvation itself. Behind them, Vivian's voice rose in indignant protest, but Emma couldn't hear the words over the rushing sound of blood in her ears and the impossible feeling that her life had just changed forever. She didn't look back. For the first time in years, she was walking towards something instead of running away. She just had no idea what that something was going to cost her. He led her through corridors she had never seen, past tapestries worth more than she would earn in a lifetime, until they reached a pair of glass doors that opened onto the most beautiful garden Emma had ever imagined. Moonlight spilled across carefully tended paths, illuminating roses that bloomed impossibly late in the season and fountains that whispered secrets to the night air. "Better?" he asked softly, and when she looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time without the chaos of the banquet hall surrounding them, her breath caught all over again. He was even more devastating in the moonlight, all sharp angles and controlled power, but there was something gentle in the way he watched her that made the fear in her chest settle into something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I should go," Emma whispered, taking a half-step toward the doors they had just come through. "I should get back to work. I should clean up the mess I made. I should—" "You should stay right here," he interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that made her spine straighten instinctively. "You're not going back to that. Not tonight, not ever, if I have anything to say about it." "You don't understand." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, desperate and pleading. "That was my sister. She's right about me. I am nothing. I work in the kitchens when they need extra hands. I sleep in servants' quarters when they have room. I barely scrape by from one day to the next. You can't be seen with someone like me. It will ruin you." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the silver light, and Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks under his intense gaze. She waited for him to realize his mistake, to understand what she was trying to tell him, and send her away with the polite dismissal she deserved. Instead, he asked, "What's your name?" "Emma." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Emma." He repeated it like he was tasting something precious, rolling it around on his tongue and finding it perfect. "And the woman who spoke to you like that, she's really your sister?" Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. The shame of it burned in her throat like acid. "Tell me," he said, settling onto a stone bench beneath a climbing rose and patting the space beside him. "Tell me how you came to be here." Every instinct Emma had developed over years of survival screamed at her not to trust this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. But something about the way he looked at her, something about the golden warmth that pulsed between them whenever their eyes met, made her want to try, made her want to be brave. She perched on the edge of the bench, careful to leave space between them, and began to speak. "Our parents died when I was 15, she said, her voice steady despite the pain that still lived in those words. "A plague that swept through our village. Vivian was already married by then, already safe, but I had nowhere to go, no one to take me in. Vivian said she would help me, that family was family, but—" She trailed off, remembering those first terrible weeks in her sister's house, the constant reminders that she was a burden, a charity case, an unwanted mouth to feed. "But," he prompted gently, "she made it very clear that I was only there out of the goodness of her heart, that I owed her everything and deserved nothing. When I turned 18, she said it was time I made my own way in the world. She gave me 3 silver coins and told me not to come back." Emma had never told anyone this story before, had never had anyone who might care to listen. But something about the way he sat so still beside her, the way his attention felt like the most precious gift she had ever received, made the words spill out of her like water from a broken dam. "I've been moving from place to place ever since," she continued, "working wherever they'll have me, sleeping wherever I can find shelter. The palace kitchens hired me for the banquet season because they needed extra hands. I thought maybe, if I worked hard enough, if I stayed invisible enough, they might let me stay through winter. And now," he asked, his voice impossibly soft, "now I've ruined everything." The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, hot and humiliating against her cheeks. "They'll dismiss me for making a scene, for embarrassing the palace in front of all those important people. I'll be back on the streets before morning." To her complete shock, he reached out and gently brushed the tears from her face with his thumb. The touch sent electricity racing across her skin, and she saw something fierce and possessive flash in his storm-grey eyes. "No," he said, and there was something final in that single word. "You won't." "You can't know that," Emma whispered. "You can't promise that." "Can't I?" He smiled then, a slow, devastating thing that made her heart skip beats. "You still don't know who I am, do you?" Before she could answer, footsteps echoed across the garden paths. A palace guard appeared at the edge of the moonlight, bowed low and said, "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but the council is asking for you." The world tilted. "Your Majesty?" Emma's voice came out as barely more than a squeak. The guard's eyes widened as he seemed to realize what he had revealed. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I didn't realize—" "It's fine, Marcus." The man, the king, waved the guard away with casual authority. "Tell them I'll be along shortly." The guard bowed again and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Emma staring at the stranger who had just turned out to be the most powerful man in the kingdom. "You're the king," she breathed, scrambling to her feet and backing away from him. "You're the Alpha King and Oh, gods, I sat next to you. I told you my pathetic story. Emma." He rose from the bench with fluid grace, his voice cutting through her panic. "Emma, look at me." She couldn't bear to see the pity or amusement or disgust that would surely be written across his face now that he understood exactly how far beneath him she truly was. "I can't," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I can't do this. You're the king. You could have anyone, any noble lady in the kingdom, any princess from neighbouring realms. I'm nobody. I'm less than nobody. You're mine." The words hit her like a physical force, stopping her retreat and her spiralling thoughts in their tracks. When she finally dared to look at him, she saw something burning in his eyes that made her breath catch and her heart race. "I've been searching for you for 10 years, he said, taking a careful step toward her. 10 years since I lost my first mate in the border wars. I thought I'd never feel the bond again, thought I was destined to rule alone. But then I saw you tonight and everything changed." Emma shook her head wildly. "That's impossible. The bond doesn't work like that. It's rare, and when it happens, it's between equals, between wolves of similar standing, not between a king and a kitchen servant." "The bond doesn't care about standing," he said softly, taking another step closer. "It doesn't care about titles or bloodlines or what society thinks is appropriate. It cares about souls, Emma, and your soul calls to mine." As if to prove his point, that golden thread in her chest pulled tight, singing with recognition and longing. She could feel it now, the invisible connection that thrummed between them, growing stronger with every moment they spent together. "This is insane," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed, his mouth quirking up in a small smile. "Completely insane and absolutely perfect." He stopped just out of arm's reach, respecting the space she needed, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I know this is overwhelming," he said. "I know you're scared, and you have every right to be. But Emma, I'm not going anywhere. However long you need to trust this, to trust me, I'll wait. I've waited 10 years to find you. I can wait as long as you need." The sincerity in his voice, the patience in his eyes, the way he looked at her like she was something precious instead of something broken, made Emma's carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "I don't even know your name," she said weakly. "Adrian," he said. "My name is Adrian." "Adrian." She tested the name, found it fit perfectly on her tongue. "And you're really the Alpha King." "I really am." His smile widened slightly. "Does that change things?" Emma thought about it, about the impossibility of what he was offering, about the way her sister had laughed and declared she would die alone, about the golden thread that even now hummed with contentment at his proximity. "It changes everything," she admitted, "and nothing at all." Something shifted in his expression, something hopeful and fierce and tender all at once. "Will you let me walk you back to your quarters? Will you let me make sure you're safe?" It wasn't really about the walk, and they both knew it. It was about trust, about taking the first small step towards something that felt too big and too perfect to be real. Emma looked at him for a long moment, at this impossible man who claimed to be hers, who had defended her without knowing her name, who looked at her like she hung the stars in the sky. "Okay," she whispered, and saw his shoulders relax as if he'd been holding his breath. "Okay," he repeated, offering her his arm like a proper gentleman. "Tomorrow, if you're willing, we'll talk more. We'll figure this out together." As they walked back through the moonlit garden, Emma felt the golden thread settle warm and content in her chest. For the first time in 8 years, she wasn't walking alone. The days that followed were a strange rhythm of terror and tenderness, unlike anything Emma had ever experienced in her life. Adrian had been true to his word. Instead of the servants' quarters where she had been staying, cramped and cold with 3 other kitchen maids, Emma found herself moved to a guest wing of the palace that she hadn't even known existed. Her new room had windows that faced the sunrise, a bed so soft it felt like sleeping on clouds, and a fireplace that was kept burning day and night by servants who bowed when they saw her coming. It was overwhelming, all of it. "You don't have to bow to me," she told them repeatedly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm nobody special." But they continued to treat her with a deference that made her skin crawl with anxiety. Word had spread quickly through the palace that the king had personally moved the kitchen girl to the guest wing, that he had assigned his own personal guards to ensure her safety. The whispers followed her everywhere she went. The guards were another source of constant bewilderment. Marcus, the one who had accidentally revealed Adrian's identity, seemed to have appointed himself her personal protector. He followed at a respectful distance wherever she went, his hand never far from his sword, his eyes constantly scanning for threats that Emma couldn't imagine existed. "This is unnecessary," she protested on her third morning, turning to face him as they walked through the palace gardens. "I don't need protection. I'm not important enough for anyone to want to hurt." Marcus gave her a look that was equal parts patient and incredulous. "With respect, my lady, you're under the personal protection of the Alpha King. That makes you the most important person in this kingdom, aside from His Majesty himself." The title made her flinch. "I'm not a lady, I'm just Emma." "You're whatever His Majesty says you are," Marcus replied firmly, "and he's made his position quite clear." Adrian had made his position clear in dozens of small ways over the past week. He appeared at her door every morning with tea and pastries, insisting on sharing breakfast with her in his private study while he handled the early correspondence that came with ruling a kingdom. He walked with her through the gardens every afternoon, pointing out the different flowers and asking about her thoughts, her dreams, her fears with a patience that left her breathless. And every evening he came to her sitting room with dinner for two and sat across from her by the fireplace, talking about everything and nothing while she slowly began to relax in his presence. "Tell me about your childhood," he said one evening, his voice gentle as firelight played across his features. "Before your parents died, what were you like?" Emma tucked her feet underneath her in the comfortable chair he had insisted on having moved to her rooms. "I was different then," she admitted. "Bolder, I think. I used to climb trees that were too tall and explore places I wasn't supposed to go. My mother used to say I had no sense of proper behaviour for a young lady." "I would have liked to meet her," Adrian said softly. "She would have liked you," Emma replied without thinking, then immediately felt heat flood her cheeks. "I mean, I know what you meant." His smile was warm, understanding. "What else do you remember?" So she told him. About summer afternoons spent reading under the old oak behind their cottage, about helping her father in his workshop, learning to carve wood with tools that were too big for her small hands, about the way her mother hummed while she cooked, filling their simple home with music and warmth, and the kind of love that made everything else feel possible. "You miss them," Adrian observed, "every day." The admission came easier than it should have. "Sometimes I forget for just a moment, and I think about something I want to tell them, and then I remember." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Emma's chest ache in sympathy. "I lost my parents young too," he said. "A hunting accident when I was 16. One day I was a prince with all the time in the world to figure out who I wanted to be, and the next I was a king with the weight of an entire kingdom on my shoulders." Emma had heard the stories, of course. Everyone knew about the tragedy that had made Adrian king before his time. But hearing it from him, seeing the pain that still lived in his eyes 8 years later, made it real in a way that court gossip never could. "Is that when you met your first mate?" she asked carefully. His smile was sad but not bitter. "Elena. Yes, I met her about a year after my coronation. She was the daughter of a neighbouring lord, sent to court to serve as a lady-in-waiting to my aunt. The bond hit us both like lightning." Emma tried to ignore the sharp spike of what felt suspiciously like jealousy in her chest. "She was beautiful. She was everything," Adrian said simply. "Kind and clever and brave enough to tell me when I was being an arrogant ass, which happened more often than I care to admit. She helped me figure out how to be a king instead of just wearing the crown. What happened to her?" Adrian's jaw tightened, and for a moment Emma thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was carefully controlled. "Border conflict with the Eastern Territories. What should have been a simple diplomatic mission turned into an ambush. Elena insisted on coming with me because she said the enemy lord's wife would be more likely to negotiate if there was another woman present. She was probably right. She usually was." Emma's heart clenched. "Adrian, I'm so sorry." "She died in my arms," he continued, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Took an arrow meant for me and died telling me she loved me. I thought that was it for me, thought I'd used up my one chance at happiness." The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief and understanding. Emma wanted to reach for him, to offer comfort, but she didn't dare. Instead, she said, "But you don't think that anymore?" Adrian looked at her then, really looked at her, and the intensity in his storm-grey eyes made her breath catch. "No, I don't think that anymore." The golden thread in her chest hummed with warmth, and Emma felt something shift between them. Something deeper than attraction, deeper than the supernatural bond that connected their souls. Something that felt dangerously close to trust. "This is insane," she whispered, echoing her words from the garden. "Completely," Adrian agreed, leaning forward slightly. "Are you willing to try it anyway?" Emma opened her mouth to answer when a sharp knock interrupted them. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but there's been a development you should know about." Adrian straightened, immediately shifting into the king he was. "What kind of development?" Marcus glanced at Emma, clearly uncomfortable. "Perhaps this conversation should be private?" "She stays," Adrian said firmly. "What's happened?" "Lady Vivian has been spreading rumours throughout the court," Marcus reported, "about Lady Emma's background, her time before coming to the palace. Some of the visiting nobles have expressed concern about the appropriateness of her presence here." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Of course Vivian wouldn't let this go. Her sister had never been able to stand seeing Emma happy, had never missed an opportunity to tear her down, and now she had the perfect ammunition. "What kind of rumours?" Adrian's voice was dangerously quiet. "She's telling people that Lady Emma worked in taverns before coming here, that she entertained men for money. She's suggesting that Lady Emma is using unseemly means to gain your favour." The words hit Emma like physical blows. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the rushing sound of blood in her ears and the sick certainty that her worst fears were coming true. Everyone would know now. Everyone would think the worst of her, of Adrian, of whatever impossible thing was growing between them. "It's not true," she said quickly, desperately. I worked in taverns, yes, but only serving drinks and food. I never—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't force the words past the shame that was choking her. "Emma," Adrian's voice was gentle but firm, "look at me." She couldn't bear to see the doubt in his eyes, the disappointment, the slow realization that maybe her sister was right about her after all. "I should go," she whispered, standing on unsteady legs. "I should leave before this gets worse, before it damages your reputation beyond repair. Vivian's right. I don't belong here." "You're not going anywhere." Adrian was on his feet too, moving toward her with careful, deliberate steps. "And Vivian is about to learn what happens to people who threaten what's mine." "But what if they're right?" Emma's voice broke on the words. "What if I'm not good enough for this for you? What if I'm just fooling myself into thinking—" "Emma!" Adrian's hands came up to cup her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You are everything. Do you hear me? Everything. And tomorrow I'm going to make sure the entire kingdom understands that." The conviction in his voice, the fierce protectiveness in his touch, made the golden thread in Emma's chest sing with recognition. But fear was stronger than hope. Fear was safer than trust. And she had been afraid for so long that she didn't know how to be anything else. "I'm scared," she admitted in a whisper. "I know," Adrian said softly, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had fallen. "But you don't have to be scared alone anymore. Whatever happens, we face it together." He leaned forward then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, when she stayed perfectly still and let him close the distance between them, his lips touched hers with a gentleness that made her soul ache. The kiss was soft, reverent, nothing like the desperate claiming she might have expected. It was a promise, a question, a declaration of intent, all wrapped into one perfect moment that made the golden thread between them flare bright and warm. When they broke apart, Emma felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, not yet, but the possibility of it. The beginning of something that might, eventually, grow into the kind of trust she had never thought she would be brave enough to feel again. "Tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "Tomorrow," Adrian confirmed. "I promise you, Emma, after tomorrow no one will ever doubt where you belong again." The grand diplomatic banquet was supposed to be a celebration of unity between the Northern Territories and their neighbouring kingdoms. Representatives from the eastern courts, the southern principalities, and the western clans had all gathered in the palace's great hall, their finest clothes glittering under the light of 1,000 candles as they discussed trade agreements and border treaties that would shape the next decade of peace. Emma had tried to stay away. "I don't belong there," she had told Adrian that morning as he prepared for the evening's festivities. "All those important people, all those nobles who've been hearing Vivian's rumours. I'll only embarrass you." Adrian had taken her hands in his storm grey eyes serious and determined. "You belong at my side, always, and tonight everyone is going to understand that." But even as she allowed him to escort her into the great hall, even as she wore the midnight blue gown he had insisted on having made for her, Emma felt like she was walking to her own execution. Every eye in the room seemed to track their movement as they entered. Every whispered conversation seemed to pause just long enough for her to imagine what they might be saying about her. The gown was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she had ever dreamed of wearing. It fit her perfectly, the silk flowing around her like water, the colour bringing out the deep brown of her eyes and making her skin glow in the candlelight. Adrian had told her she looked radiant, had kissed her hand, and promised that everything would be perfect. But Emma knew better than to trust promises like that. In her experience, perfect moments were usually just the calm before everything fell apart. They had made it through the first hour without incident. Adrian introduced her to visiting dignitaries as his honoured guest, his hand never leaving the small of her back, his attention focused on her as if she were the only person in the room worth noticing. Emma tried to smile, tried to make polite conversation, tried to ignore the calculating looks and barely concealed whispers that followed in their wake. Then Vivian arrived. Her sister swept into the hall like a storm cloud, magnificent in crimson silk and rubies, her husband trailing behind her with the uncomfortable expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. Emma felt her blood go cold the moment their eyes met across the crowded room. "She's here," Emma whispered to Adrian, her voice tight with anxiety. Adrian followed her gaze, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She won't cause a scene, not here, not with so many witnesses." But Emma knew her sister better than that. Vivian had never cared about witnesses. If anything, she preferred an audience for her cruelest moments. It took exactly 20 minutes for Vivian to make her move. Emma had been speaking with the wife of the Eastern ambassador, trying desperately to remember everything Adrian had taught her about diplomatic etiquette, when Vivian appeared at her shoulder as if summoned by Emma's worst fears. "Sister dear," Vivian's voice carried that familiar note of false sweetness that made Emma's skin crawl. "How lovely to see you again, though I must say you've certainly risen in the world since we last spoke." The Eastern ambassador's wife looked between them with obvious curiosity, and Emma felt heat flood her cheeks. "Vivian, please, "Oh, don't be modest," Vivian continued, her voice growing louder, drawing the attention of nearby conversations. "Everyone's been talking about your remarkable transformation from kitchen servant to the king's companion. It's quite the fairy tale, really." Emma glanced desperately around the room, looking for Adrian, but he was trapped in conversation with a group of Western clan leaders on the far side of the hall. Too far away to help, too far away to stop what was about to happen. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," the Eastern ambassador's wife said delicately, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "Oh, no misunderstanding at all," Vivian laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "You see, my dear sister has quite the talent for reinventing herself. Tell me, Emma, have you shared with His Majesty the full story of your employment history, or are you still pretending to be the innocent little orphan?" Emma's heart stopped. Around them, more heads were turning, more conversations falling silent as Vivian's voice carried across the marble floors. This was it. This was the moment everything would come crashing down. "Vivian, stop!" Emma whispered desperately. "Please." "Stop?" Vivian's eyes glittered with malicious delight. "But we're just getting to the interesting part. You see," she addressed the growing crowd of listeners, "my sister wasn't just working in any kitchen before she came here. She was working in the Serpent's Den Tavern on the docks. Do you know it? Quite the colourful establishment, very popular with sailors and merchants looking for more than just a hot meal." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Emma felt the world tilt beneath her feet as dozens of pairs of eyes fixed on her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to pity. The golden thread in her chest constricted painfully as if it were trying to pull her away from this moment, away from the humiliation that was drowning her. "That's not—" Emma tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but Vivian wasn't finished. "Oh, she was quite popular from what I hear," Vivian continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent hall. "Men would request her specifically. She had such a gift for making them feel welcome. I suppose old habits die hard, don't they, sister? Though I must admit your latest conquest is quite impressive. A king, mother and father would be so proud." The words hit Emma like physical blows. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the rushing sound of blood in her ears and the sick knowledge that everyone in this room now believed the worst possible version of her story. She had served drinks and food at the Serpent's Den, yes, but only because it was the only place desperate enough to hire a girl with no references and nowhere to go. She had endured unwanted advances and crude comments because she had needed the work, had needed the few copper coins that meant the difference between a roof over her head and sleeping in alleyways. But now, twisted by Vivian's poisoned tongue, that survival looked like something else entirely. "I need to go," Emma whispered, backing away from Vivian's triumphant smile and the crowd's judgmental stares. "I need to—" "Going so soon?" Vivian called after her. "But we haven't even gotten to the best part yet. Tell them about the room upstairs, Emma. Tell them about how you—" "Enough!" The word cracked across the great hall like thunder, so full of barely controlled fury that every person in the room froze instantly. Emma turned to see Adrian striding through the crowd, his face a mask of royal authority and lethal calm. Nobles scattered out of his path like leaves before a storm, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. When he reached them, he didn't look at Vivian, didn't acknowledge the crowd of gawking spectators. His entire focus was on Emma, and the gentle concern in his eyes made her want to cry. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice meant for her alone. Emma shook her head, not trusting her voice. She wasn't all right. She would never be all right again. Everyone knew now. Everyone believed the worst of her, and soon they would believe the worst of him for associating with her. Adrian nodded once, as if he understood everything she couldn't say. Then he turned to face Vivian, and Emma had never seen anything more terrifying than the cold fury in the Alpha King's eyes. "You have something you'd like to say about my mate?" His voice was quiet, conversational, but it carried the kind of authority that made grown men kneel and enemies surrender. Vivian, for the first time since Emma had known her, seemed to realise she might have made a mistake, but she was too committed to back down now. "I was simply sharing some family history, Your Majesty," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Surely you deserve to know the truth about the woman you've been entertaining." "The truth?" Adrian repeated the words slowly, as if he were tasting something bitter. "You want to talk about truth? Very well." He moved to stand beside Emma, his presence solid and warm and protective. When he spoke again, his voice carried to every corner of the silent hall. "The truth is that this woman survived things that would have broken most of you. The truth is that she was orphaned as a child and abandoned by the very family who should have protected her. The truth is that she worked wherever she could find employment, endured whatever she had to endure, did whatever was necessary to stay alive in a world that showed her no kindness and offered her no help." Emma felt tears slip down her cheeks as Adrian's words washed over her, each one a balm against the wounds Vivian had torn open. "The truth," Adrian continued, his voice growing stronger, more fierce, "is that she has more courage in her smallest finger than most of you have in your entire bodies. She could have given up. She could have let the cruelty of this world make her cruel in return. Instead, she chose kindness. She chose hope. She chose to keep believing in goodness even when goodness was nowhere to be found." He turned to look at Emma then, and the love in his eyes was so overwhelming that she forgot how to breathe. "The truth is that she is my fated mate, chosen by the gods themselves, and I would rather spend one day with her than a lifetime with anyone else in this room." The hall erupted in whispers, but Adrian wasn't finished. He turned back to Vivian, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold enough to freeze fire. "You will leave my kingdom tonight. You will never return. And if I ever hear of you speaking my mate's name again, if I ever learn that you have caused her so much as a moment's pain, I will show you exactly why they call me the Alpha King." Vivian's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "You can't. I'm a citizen of this kingdom." "You were a citizen of this kingdom," Adrian corrected. "As of this moment, you are an enemy of the crown. Marcus will escort you to the border personally." Marcus materialized at Adrian's shoulder as if he had been waiting for the command. "It would be my pleasure, Your Majesty." "This is ridiculous," Vivian sputtered, looking around the room for support and finding none. "She's nobody. She's nothing. She, Adrian said with quiet finality, "is everything." He took Emma's hand then, raised it to his lips, and kissed her knuckles with a reverence that made the golden thread in her chest flare bright and warm. When he straightened, he addressed the crowd one final time. "Lady Emma is under my personal protection and will be treated with the respect due to my chosen mate. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to take it up with me directly." The threat in those words was unmistakable, and Emma watched as dozens of heads nodded in immediate agreement. No one wanted to test the Alpha King's patience any further. As Adrian led her from the hall, his arm strong and steady around her waist, Emma heard Vivian's voice rise one last time in desperate protest. But it was Marcus who answered, his tone politely professional. "This way, my lady. The border is a lovely ride this time of night." Outside the great hall, in the quiet of the moonlit corridor, Adrian stopped and turned to face her. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears she couldn't seem to stop. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I ruined everything. I embarrassed you in front of all those important people. Emma." His voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me." She forced herself to meet his eyes, expecting to see disappointment or regret. Instead, she found only love. Deep, fierce, unwavering love that made her believe, for the first time in her life, that she might actually be worthy of it. "You didn't ruin anything," he said softly. "You survived, and now you're home." He kissed her then, right there in the corridor with moonlight streaming through the tall windows, and Emma felt something break open in her chest, something that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. Trust, hope, the beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, her sister had been wrong about everything. Emma woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through her windows and the quiet realization that everything had changed. Not just the events of the previous evening, though those still felt like something from a dream, but something deeper, something inside her chest where the golden thread lived, warm and steady and no longer pulling with desperate longing, but settled with quiet contentment. For the first time in 8 years she wasn't afraid. "I'm tired of running," she had told Adrian the night before, her voice steady despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "I want to stay. I want to try this, whatever this is, with you." The relief in his eyes had been worth every moment of terror that had led to that decision. He had kissed her again, soft and reverent and full of promises that she was finally ready to believe. And when he had asked, his voice carefully controlled, if she wanted him to stay with her that night, she had surprised them both by saying yes. Nothing had happened beyond holding each other until dawn, but everything had changed anyway. For the first time in her life, Emma had fallen asleep feeling completely safe, wrapped in the arms of a man who looked at her like she hung the stars in the sky and would move heaven and earth to protect her from anyone who tried to dim her light. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Adrian with his usual offering of morning tea and pastries. Instead, Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "Good morning, my lady. His Majesty requests your presence in the throne room at your earliest convenience." Emma's stomach dropped. The throne room was where official business was conducted, where the king held court and made pronouncements that affected the entire kingdom. It wasn't where lovers shared intimate conversations over breakfast. "Is everything all right?" she asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of her voice. Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Everything is perfect, my lady. His Majesty simply has something he wishes to share with the court, something that requires your presence." An hour later, Emma found herself standing outside the massive oak doors of the throne room, wearing another of the beautiful gowns that had appeared in her wardrobe as if by magic. This one was deep emerald green, the colour of forest shadows and spring growth, and it made her feel like someone who belonged in a palace instead of someone who was merely visiting. When the doors opened and she saw the crowd waiting inside, her breath caught. It seemed like half the kingdom was there, packed into every available space, their faces turned expectantly toward the throne where Adrian sat in full royal regalia. He looked magnificent and intimidating, and every inch the Alpha King. But when his eyes found hers across the room, his expression softened into something warm and private and meant only for her. "Lady Emma," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the vast room, "please join me." The crowd parted as she walked down the centre aisle, whispers following in her wake, but they weren't the cruel whispers of the night before. These were different, curious, respectful, tinged with anticipation rather than judgment. When she reached the throne, Adrian rose and descended the steps to meet her, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that made the golden thread hum with contentment. "People of the Northern Territories," he began, his voice ringing with royal authority, "I have called you here today to share news that will shape the future of our kingdom." Emma's heart began to race. Surely he wasn't going to... "For 10 years I have ruled alone, believing that fate had given me my one chance at happiness and taken it away just as quickly. I accepted that sacrifice as the price of leadership, the cost of putting kingdom before self." Adrian's hands tightened slightly on hers, and she could feel the steady strength of him anchoring her as the room held its collective breath. But the gods, it seems, had other plans. They sent me a woman who has shown me that true strength isn't about standing alone, but about finding someone worthy of standing beside, someone who has faced the worst this world has to offer and emerged not bitter, but kind, not broken, but beautifully, impossibly whole. He turned to look at her then, and Emma felt tears prick at her eyes at the love she saw written across his features. "Emma," he said softly, his voice meant for her alone, even though hundreds of people were listening. "You have been my salvation in every way that matters. Will you do me the honour of becoming my wife, my queen, my partner in all things for all the days of our lives?" The throne room erupted in cheers and applause, but Emma barely heard it over the rushing sound of blood in her ears and the wild beating of her heart. Adrian was proposing to her. In front of the entire kingdom, in front of nobles and commoners alike, he was claiming her as his equal and asking her to spend forever at his side. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I will." Adrian's smile was radiant as he slipped a ring onto her finger, a band of white gold set with a stone that caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 brilliant fragments. It was the most beautiful thing Emma had ever seen, but it paled in comparison to the look in his eyes as he leaned down to kiss her. The crowd roared its approval, and Emma felt the golden thread in her chest expand until it felt like it encompassed her entire being, connecting her not just to Adrian, but to this place, these people, this life she had never dared to dream might be hers. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of planning and preparation, unlike anything Emma could have imagined. The palace buzzed with activity as arrangements were made for what everyone was calling the wedding of the century. Seamstresses appeared with bolts of silk and lace. Florists consulted with her about seasonal blooms, and the palace chef presented her with an endless parade of cake samples that made her laugh with their absurd deliciousness. Through it all, Adrian was patient and attentive, making sure she never felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were planning. He helped her navigate the complex etiquette of royal weddings, explaining traditions and customs with the kind of gentle humour that made even the most intimidating protocols seem manageable. "Are you sure about this?" she asked him one evening as they reviewed seating charts for the wedding feast. "All these people, all this ceremony, we could just slip away and be married quietly in the garden." Adrian looked up from the parchment he was studying, his storm-grey eyes serious. "Is that what you want?" Emma considered it. Part of her, the part that had spent years hiding and trying to stay invisible, was tempted by the idea of a simple ceremony with just the two of them and a priest. But a larger part, the part that was growing stronger every day, wanted something different. "No," she said slowly, "I want them to see. I want everyone to know that this is real, that you chose me not despite who I am, but because of it. I want them to understand that love doesn't care about bloodlines or birth certificates or what society thinks is appropriate." Adrian's smile was soft and proud and full of the kind of love that made her believe she could conquer kingdoms. "Then we'll give them a wedding they'll never forget." He was right. The ceremony was magnificent, held in the palace's great hall with representatives from every corner of the kingdom and beyond in attendance. Emma walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk and ancient lace, her head held high and her heart full of a confidence she had never thought possible. When Adrian took her hands and spoke his vows, promising to love and protect and cherish her for all the days of their lives, Emma felt the last of her old fears finally fall away. She was no longer the frightened girl who had spilled wine at a banquet and waited for the world to end. She was a woman who had found her strength, her voice, her place in the world. "I promise to stand beside you," she said, her voice clear and strong, "through joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, in this life and whatever comes after. I promise to love you not just with my heart, but with all that I am, all that I've been, and all that we'll become together." When the priest pronounced them married and Adrian kissed her, the golden thread that had connected them from the very beginning flared bright and warm and permanent, sealing them together in a way that went beyond ceremony or law or even the supernatural bond that had brought them together. That night, in the privacy of their shared chambers, they finally gave themselves to each other completely. Adrian was gentle and patient, worshipping her body like it was something sacred, showing her with touch and whisper and reverent kiss exactly how precious she was to him. "Mine," he murmured against her skin as he marked her with the ancient ritual that would make their bond visible to all supernatural beings. "My mate, my queen, my heart." "Yours," Emma agreed, her voice breathless with wonder and pleasure and the overwhelming rightness of it all. "Always yours." Afterward, as they lay tangled together in sheets of silk and moonlight, Emma marvelled at how different this felt from anything she had ever imagined. There was no shame here, no fear, no desperate attempt to disappear or become smaller. There was only love, pure and bright and strong enough to heal wounds she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be whole. "Do you ever think about her?" Emma asked quietly, tracing patterns on Adrian's chest with her fingertip. "Elena?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but not the way you might think. I think about how she would have liked you, how she would have been happy that I found love again, found someone who makes me want to be the best version of myself." Emma smiled against his shoulder. "I think I would have liked her too." "You would have," Adrian agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "She had your courage, your determination to see the good in everything, even when the world was determined to show you otherwise." They were quiet for a while, comfortable in each other's arms and in the knowledge that they had found something rare and precious and worth fighting for. "Adrian," Emma said eventually, my sister was wrong about everything." Adrian's arms tightened around her, protective and possessive and infinitely gentle. "She was wrong about everything," he agreed. "You didn't die alone. You found your home." Emma closed her eyes and let herself sink into the warmth of his embrace, into the certainty that this was where she belonged. Not because she was nothing and grateful for any kindness, but because she was everything and deserving of a love that matched her worth. For the first time in her life, Emma fell asleep without a single fear about what tomorrow might bring. She was loved, she was chosen, she was home, and that was everything. 6 months later, the kingdom had never been stronger. Emma stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly, where their child grew safe and loved. Below in the courtyard, she could see the early morning bustle of palace life beginning, servants and guards and courtiers all moving with the easy efficiency of a place that had found its rhythm. It was hard to believe sometimes that this was her life now, that the frightened girl who had spilled wine and waited for the world to end had become Queen Emma, beloved by her people and cherished by her mate. The transformation still amazed her, not just in circumstances, but in herself. She stood taller now, spoke with confidence, made decisions that affected thousands of lives without the paralyzing fear that had once defined her every move. Lost in thought, Adrian's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and sleep rough in the way that never failed to make her heart skip. Emma smiled as strong arms wrapped around her from behind, Adrian's hands coming to rest over hers on their growing child. Just marvelling at how different everything is. Different how? He pressed a kiss to the side of her neck, and she could feel his smile against her skin. All of it. Emma leaned back into his warmth, still amazed that she was allowed to have this, to be held and treasured and loved without reservation. 6 months ago, I was invisible. Now I have ladies in waiting who hang on my every word, and nobles from across the kingdom seeking my counsel on matters of state. It was true. What had started as Adrian's gentle encouragement for her to find her voice had blossomed into something neither of them had quite expected. Emma had discovered a natural talent for diplomacy, for seeing solutions to problems that had puzzled the council for months. Her programs for protecting vulnerable women had become the model for neighbouring kingdoms, and her quiet strength had earned the respect of even the most traditional nobles. "You were never invisible," Adrian murmured. "You were just waiting for the right people to see you." Emma turned in his arms, studying the face that had become as familiar and necessary as breathing. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night in the garden, about waiting however long I needed?" "I remember." His storm-grey eyes were soft with memory. "I would have waited forever." "I know." Emma reached up to cup his cheek, marvelling as she always did at the way this powerful, dangerous man went gentle under her touch. That's what made me brave enough to stop running. A knock at the chamber door interrupted them, and Marcus's voice called through the wood. "Your Majesties, forgive the intrusion, but the Morning Council is requesting an audience. Something about the Eastern Territory trade agreements." Adrian sighed, but it was the contented sigh of a man who loved his work rather than the exhausted sound of someone burdened by duty. "Tell them we'll be down shortly," he called back. "We?" Emma raised an eyebrow. "I'm perfectly capable of handling council meetings while you attend to other matters, you know." "I know." Adrian's smile was proud and fond. "But I prefer ruling beside you. Makes everything better." An hour later, they sat side by side in the council chamber, reviewing proposals and settling disputes with the easy partnership that had become their hallmark. Emma loved these moments, loved the way Adrian valued her opinions, and the way the council had learned to respect her judgment. She was no longer the woman who apologised for taking up space. She was a queen who had earned her place at this table. "The Miners' Guild is requesting an extension on their safety improvements," Lord Garrett reported. "They claim the timeline is unrealistic." "What do you think?" Adrian asked Emma, deferring to her expertise in matters affecting the kingdom's working people. Emma considered carefully. "I think a 6-month extension is reasonable, provided they agree to interim inspections and immediate implementation of the most critical safety measures. Lives are more important than timelines, but we can't let them use this as an excuse to postpone indefinitely." The council murmured approval, and Lord Garrett made notes. It still thrilled Emma sometimes, the way her words carried weight, the way decisions she made would affect real people's lives in meaningful ways. After the meeting, as they walked through the palace gardens where their love story had truly begun, Adrian squeezed her hand gently. "There's something I want to show you." He led her to a part of the garden she hadn't visited before, where workers were putting finishing touches on what looked like a small building of warm stone and tall windows. "It's beautiful," Emma said, studying the elegant lines and welcoming facade. "What is it?" "A sanctuary," Adrian explained, "for women who need a safe place to start over. Somewhere they can learn skills, find work, discover their own strength. I thought we could call it the Emma Centre." Emma stared at him, overwhelmed by the gesture and everything it represented. "Adrian, you don't have to—" "I want to," he said firmly. "You've shown me that healing is possible, that broken things can become beautiful again. I want to offer that same hope to others." Tears pricked at Emma's eyes as she imagined the women who would find safety within these walls, who would discover their own worth the way she had discovered hers. "It's perfect." "There's more." Adrian's expression turned slightly mischievous. "We received a letter yesterday, someone requesting permission to visit the kingdom." "Oh?" Emma couldn't imagine who would have Adrian looking quite so pleased with himself. "Your sister," he said carefully. "Vivian. She's written asking for forgiveness, saying she's had time to think about her behaviour and realises she was wrong. She wants to make amends." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected development. 6 months ago, the thought of seeing Vivian again would have sent her into a panic. Now she felt only a distant sadness for the sister who had let jealousy and bitterness poison her heart. "What do you think?" Adrian asked. "Do you want to see her?" Emma considered it. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm willing to receive her letter and consider a supervised visit, but not because I need her approval or her apology, because I'm secure enough now to offer forgiveness without expecting her to change." Adrian's smile was radiant with pride. My wise queen. Your stubborn queen, Emma corrected with a laugh. Remember, I'm the one who insisted on reorganizing the entire tax system despite your treasurer's protests. And you were right, as usual. Adrian pulled her close, his hands settling on her growing belly. Speaking of which, have you given any thought to names? Emma smiled, leaning into his warmth. For a girl, I was thinking Elena, if that's all right with you. Adrian's eyes went soft. She would be honoured. And for a boy? Something strong, something that means hope or new beginning. Emma paused, struck by sudden inspiration. What about Adrian? Adrian II? Absolutely not. Adrian's response was immediate and firm. This child will make their own name, their own legacy. They won't be weighed down by their father's history. Emma laughed, delighted by his vehemence. All right, no family names. We'll find something perfect and completely their own. As they walked back toward the palace, Emma caught sight of their reflection in one of the tall windows. She looked radiant, glowing with health and happiness, her crown catching the afternoon light. Beside her, Adrian looked every inch the devoted husband and future father, his attention focused entirely on her, as if she were the most fascinating thing in his world. It was such a far cry from the broken girl who had cowered in servants' quarters and believed herself worthless that Emma had to stop and stare for a moment. "What is it?" Adrian asked, following her gaze. "I was just thinking about that night at the banquet," Emma said softly, "when Vivian said I would die alone, that no one could ever want someone like me. She was so certain she was right." Adrian's arms tightened around her, protective even now. She was wrong about everything. Yes, she was. Emma smiled, one hand on her belly where their child grew, the other intertwined with her mate's. Instead of dying alone, I found my home. Instead of being unwanted, I became someone's everything. Instead of surviving, I learned to thrive. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their kingdom, over the life they had built together from the ashes of loneliness and pain. Emma felt the golden thread that connected them pulse warm and steady in her chest, no longer pulling with desperate need, but settled with deep contentment. "I love you," she said, the words as natural as breathing now. "I love you too," Adrian replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "My queen, my mate, my heart." As they walked inside together, Emma marvelled at the simple miracle of it all. Love had found her when she least expected it, had seen worth in her when she could see none in herself, had transformed her from a survivor into someone who thrived. And tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to build something beautiful together. She couldn't wait to see what came next. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility, and anchored in the unshakable foundation of their love. Emma had learned to trust in that love, to believe in her own worth, to stand tall as the queen she had never dared dream she could become. Vivian had been wrong about everything. Emma hadn't died alone. She had found her home, her heart, her happily ever after, and it was everything she had never known she was brave enough to want. Where are you listening from? I love imagining all the different places these stories reach, all the different people who find hope in tales of love, conquering fear and worthiness, triumphing over shame. If you'd like to support me and help more people discover these stories of healing and belonging, please subscribe. It's free and it means everything to me. Let's meet in the comments and share the places where love has found us when we least expected it.